Hey everyone, welcome back to the People's Perspective on Development with your host, myself, Tunisia Kassam. We've had a wonderful journey discussing and unpacking definitions, concepts, case studies, perspectives from academics, perspectives from professionals, and of course, your input on public space and public life. Today is our last episode, and I'm really excited that I got to experience this journey and these discussions with you. And as we end off today, I'd love for you to grab a cup of coffee and let's recap. As you grab your cup of coffee, I'm going to walk you through today's episode where we're going to take a moment to reflect on the podcast as a whole and this topic on public space as an area of development that we continuously try to redevelop and definitely relook at perspectives about what does public space mean not only for communities but also for South Africa. In episode 2, we looked at the relationship between public life and public space and where do these two meet. We took a turn and had a wonderful conversation with one of key professionals in the industry, and then we had a chance to hear from you, your inputs, your thoughts and ideas on what makes public space and the spaces that you live in, the spaces you commute in, and of course, the spaces that you go to for entertainment, for reflection, for a breather. After that, we gathered that information and we had the chance to discuss public space with an academic, knowledgeable, prestigious role player in the field, Prof. Karina Landman, who unpacked these key terms with the understanding of what is important to South Africa, what is important to South Africa's public spaces. Can't wait for you guys to join me on this. Leave some comments. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Episode 1, what is public space? In this episode, we looked at different concepts and different ideas of what makes public space. How do we define public space? And most importantly, to leave you with the thought that public space is where social interaction and perception, urban recreation, and communities come together to engage. It is life between the buildings, life between the city itself, where we often spend time commuting, walking, traveling, pause moments as we go from our day to day activities and commitments. Very important, we had a moment where we took time to unpack theories of Jane Jacobs, who famously wrote that neighborhoods were safer when there were eyes on the street. And this is important to look at what benefits attract citizens to public space, what benefits transform communities from improved and maintained public spaces. And one of the aspects was city safety, public space safety. And here we discussed and unpacked the importance of having shared spaces that allow for surveillance and safety and ensure that pedestrians and all users are seen and heard. In terms of public life itself, which was coined by Angel, which suggests that the life of public space is found in public life. And what exactly is public life? It's about everyday activities that people take part in when they spend time with each other outside of their homes, outside of their workplaces. People create public life when they connect with each other in public space. The subject here is very important. It is the citizens and the people of communities, regardless of where they are from, the race that they are, or the income group in which they fall in. Taking it back to South Africa in episode 1, we had a discussion about the challenges and limitations of public space in South Africa, which left us with these key thoughts to unpack. How do we reclaim public space for the people in our country? What elements of the criteria we used for successful public spaces are we missing that adapts to South African context? And what should we be doing more of in terms of public space and public life to ensure that there's integration, there's equality and harmony between people and space? The relationship between public life and public space. In episode 2, we uncovered an inspiring book which we used as a planning tool to understand and observe public space and public life itself. The book, labeled How to Study Public Life, provides a framework for understanding on how people use public spaces. How do we study people in these spaces? How do we study how the space functions and is used? As well as how do we improve the design of public spaces for people and centered around people. Looking at planning, previously planners created visions of utopia. However, in this book, we start afresh and use new techniques because planning realized that it needed to serve the people in the community context, not what it ought to be, but rather what it is. The overarching theme of public life and how we put together this public life toolbox came from the fact that it is people centered. It is driven by the needs of the community and marginalized groups. There was a sense of representation between a collaborative effort of professionals, community leaders, community members. They'd put together these ideas of how they would like public space to be designed using various tools and principles. And how do we improve the knowledge received from academia all the way through into the professional practice that represents the user, the people, the citizen. With reference back to what the course is actually about, which is the coursework for the advanced planning thought and philosophies, theories, and methodologies of development planning, which is the reason why we have gathered here today, guys. It is through this toolbox that we've generated means of understanding, means of unpacking, means of comparing and contrasting. How do we look at, firstly, the world as planners, as developers, as professionals, as people? But not only that, within this podcast, we utilize certain tools that were imperative to understand how do we look at public life for the greater context, which I'll take you through. As you guys remember, episode 3 was Let's Hear from a Professional, and we were really lucky and fortunate enough to have my dear colleague, school friend, and of course, someone I've journeyed town planning with. And more than that, someone I find incredibly inspiring, as well as has a wonderful perspective specifically on public open space. My dear friend Bayiti took the time out of his day to have conversations with us on his understanding and his passion for public open space. We looked at how do they transform communities and how was recreational spaces made part of communities and neighborhoods. We unpacked how private, public open space is maintained and regulated and invested in, but limits access to specific individuals, while public space is perceived as unsafe, unclean, and a risk for females and certain individuals, even though it allows access for anyone. We linked these thoughts and processes of public open space back to understanding that westernized planning and Africanized planning needs to be differentiated. We need examples and references from countries that have similar history, have similar designs, but not only that, understanding that most of our citizens commute, from various spaces and places in and out of the city, and do not perceive open space as the same thing. In episode 4, we had the opportunity to unpack your ideas and your thoughts on the people's perspective on development. And we got to hear, how do you see your public space? How do you see your commuting space and the life in between home and work? And how do you travel in terms of walking, whether you're a cyclist or motorized vehicle or public transport? And it was wonderful to see the elements that you pointed out in our survey. This was a short survey that we did informally with random people, and I really want to thank you all for all your contributions and thoughts into sharing how we can improve your public space. And what was very key here is what your inputs brought to life. In terms of the inputs that we received from the various people that commented and provided their thoughts on the people's perspective on public space, these were the following needs and design principles that we need to consider more of: the element of safety, beautification, providing a sense of belonging, and understanding that the quality of public space is what attracts the user to utilize the space. Lively spaces, vibrant spaces that create vitality, that are colorful, that are wonderfully lit, as well as designed. Lastly, the maintenance of these public spaces and public open spaces: hygiene, cleanliness, tidiness, safety, which we hope to incorporate in the future, and with the help of this podcast, bring to light to various professionals that this is what is important to the people. In episode 5, we had the privilege of interviewing Professor Karina Landman, who is a specialist in the industry, as well as a knowledgeable academic and lecturer, and a professional in understanding the design of public open space and public spaces, as well as how they function, and the quality of public spaces in terms of, can it be sustainable for our future generations? Prof. Karina Landman has worked in various projects, not only in terms of design and town planning, but also in research. Her field of study has been her love for evolving public spaces and their resilience, and how do they transform communities as well as create inclusive spaces for anyone to access without any discrimination, as well as accessibility in terms of mobility. With that being shared, we touched on very key points, and I really hope that you've all made the time to go through each episode from episode 5 that broke down her thoughts and understanding of public space, the functionality, and the design, and how do they come together, not only to create beautiful spaces, but user-friendly spaces. Considering her childhood, the transition of living in a town, moving into the city life, and getting to travel abroad has broadened her eyes and her perspective on how public space can be used. Taking it back to the land use management systems, we noted that demarcation and vast subdivision can actually hinder the development of public spaces in urban areas through zoning, and of course the rigid planning practices that only allow a certain percentage or a certain number of public spaces, which usually get demarcated to public open space. And we want to change that. How do we incorporate public space to evolve with communities and the present needs of the people? Which is where we tackle the difference between common space and public space. The benefits of breathing room, cultural integration, as well as social vibrancy that public spaces can bring for South Africans, is something that we need to consider when designing and planning for public space. Lastly, we looked at how do people understand what is public space? What are the names that people give public space? Is it a gathering space? Is it a ceremonial space? Is it a meeting space? And how does what we name these elements of planning impact people's understanding of what it is and why do they need it in their communities? Lastly, does the space share the community's vision and need? Maybe people would want more houses instead of a park, which was brought up in a case study in which Prof. Karina Landman did research in. And with the abundance of parks being provided, for example, in comparison to the needs that the community require, we've seen an increase in informality and squatting, which shows, are we listening to the people? Taking it back to the planning toolbox, how do we relate public space and public life? Specifically for this study, I looked at the following tools. Firstly, the subject. Who is public space for? Citizens and communities. The context. What are the perceptions that public space evokes or already has? The data. We have an abundance of spatial planning policy and data that circulates in and among us. How have these studies been used to achieve the objectives set out by planners? And lastly, representation, which we had a reflection of in the case studies, is not coming through in terms of what the community needs versus what we are supplying. And how do we attend to this disjuncture? In the ending thoughts of today's recap, I want us to just have a look at those inspiring reads once again, which we got to unpack how to study public life. And I hope that you take the time to invest in understanding these various books. However, I'd also like to add that we brought in another bedtime reading, which we've been fortunate enough to have our very own Professor Karina Landman being the author for Evolving Public Space in South Africa. Please take the time out to purchase the book and really understand the concept of public space in the South African culture and how can we transform it. It's a wonderful book with imagery, very interactive and beneficial, not only to students and academics, but just to understanding the spaces we live in. Last but not least, we had a discussion on rough sleeping, which is here the importance of community participation. In Professor Karina Landman's case studies and research, it was brought to life that this term or phenomena of rough sleeping is where you have professionals, people who are employed, living in and around the city informally because the commute is too far or too expensive to get to work. And where they live is too far out the city. So, how do we create a sense of identity? Is what I would like to leave with you today. In the next episode of The People's Perspective on Development, we're going to unpack public space further. How do we design public space for girls? And that is where the thought comes in of how do we create a sense of identity to link the needs of the people back to the design of public space. I can't wait for you to tune in on our next podcast where we will unpack public space, but in a gender context. And how do we design for that? But for now, this is me bidding you farewell. It's been a great journey with you guys. Please leave your comments. I cannot wait to hear from you all. And don't forget, the people's perspective on development is about you. It's about contributing towards how you want to live in the spaces that you do. Bye, everyone. I'm your host, Tanisha Cassim.